Hi everyone, welcome to Best Recapped Movie. Today we want to speak about movie that called the Tomorrow War. The story is about a time in the future when aliens have invaded the Earth and are destroying the human race. So humans go back in time with the help of a new technology to recruit new soldiers to defeat their enemy. This video contains spoiler. In December 2022, we see Dan Forrester walking into the house during the Christmas holidays while on the phone looking for a new job. He talks about his military background and his current job as a biology teacher and is very confident that he will get his dream job. But a few minutes later, he is informed that someone else has won the job. Dan returns home disappointed. Emmy shows his wife the letter that Dan's father sent to Dan's daughter, Muri, but Dan throws the letter in the trash. Because the relationship between him and his father is broken. Then, Dan and Muri watch the soccer World Cup matches. Dan says they are the best players in the world. Muri says that she also wants to be the best, like her father who was the best in science. Suddenly, a portal is created in the football field and a large number of military men and women come out of it. One of them, named Lieutenant Hart, explains that they came from 30 years in the future, where the world is involved in a war with aliens and they will be defeated and destroyed in 11 months. So they have returned to the past to ask for help to defeat the aliens.
You are our last hope.
A few months later, we see in the news that humans have been able to obtain the conditions for traveling to the future. They send the first batch of soldiers to participate in the war, but a week later few of them return alive. But few soldiers are qualified to travel through time, so they need the help of civilians in the war. However, the general public is against participating in a war that does not concern them. But there are only 500,000 people left in the future and they must be helped. In the middle of the night, we see Muri, who had a nightmare that her parents were being taken to war. Dan tries to calm her down. The next day, Dan talks enthusiastically about biology in the classroom, but his students are not interested in this lesson. So he asks them to talk about something they like. Martin, who always talks about volcanoes, is ignored by Dan.
Volcanoes are nature's fury, guys.
The students are desperate to try and study because they are aware of the war situation in the future and they know that they will all be killed in the end. But Dan says they should try, and the world needs scientists to solve its problems in the future. At this moment, Dan receives a message inviting him to join the war. He goes to a military base to conduct experiments. In the tests, it is clear that Dan has the necessary conditions to participate in the war. Also, with the help of an advanced device, he is informed that he will be killed in 2030. Then a bracelet is installed on his hand, with the help of which they can take Dan to the future and track him. And Dan is not allowed to tamper with it until his service is over, or he will be imprisoned or his wife or child will replace him in the war. A little later, we see Emmy helping the survivors of the future war to recover psychologically. While Emmy is scared to hear what will happen in the upcoming war, Dan enters and reveals that he must be sent to war. Emmy warns that only 30% of people come back alive and they have severe mental disorders. So they have to run away. Dan explains about the bracelet, but Emmy says that Dan knows who can fix the bracelet problem. So Dan goes to someone who can remove the bracelet. James Daniel Forrester, Dan's father, is a veteran military man and a genius in the electrical industry. Dan realizes that his father is in a good financial situation and talks to him about his source of income. They then discuss their old problems, where James suddenly left Dan and his mother and never came back. James explains that he was not in a good mental condition after the Vietnam War and left them alone to help Dan's mother. Dan gets angry at this answer and asks James not to send any more letters to Muri and leaves without removing the bracelet. Emmy is saddened by this, but Dan says that the war will only last 7 days and he will come back alive.
7 days, I'll survive. I'm a pretty tough guy.
Dan then goes to Muri to say goodbye. He PR'd during the deployment. Lieutenant Hart gives them the necessary explanations about how to kill aliens and the conditions of war. She also explains that after 7 days, if they are alive, wherever they are, they will return to the past with the help of the bracelet.
7 days.
That's 168 hours.
The bracelet then reveals that Dan will be sent with the investigation team. Another of Dan's companions, Charlie, explains about Dorian, who has been sent to war 3 times and managed to hang the claw of one of the aliens on his neck. Charlie, who is a scientist, notices that most of the people sent are over 40 years old and the people who come from the future to study them are under 30 years old. So they find that people are sent into the future who are dead at the time, and people are sent back to the past who are not yet born at that time. Pratt explains that they will join their colleagues in the future to add their knowledge and skills to prevent human extinction. Nora asks why they don't go before the war. They explain that the time jump device has limitations, that it can only move to the past in 30 years and currently they do not have the right conditions to upgrade the device. Then they explain that the white spikes for aliens disappear every 6 days to rest. And this is when soldiers are sent to war. A little later, Charlie explains that his wife was sent to war and killed. Suddenly, the alarm sounds and it is announced that everyone is ready to be dispatched. While the humans are still untrained, Pratt explains that the aliens have attacked their only research facility studying the aliens, and if they lose there they will lose the war. At the moment of dispatch, one of the commanders realizes that the landing coordinates are wrong, but there is not enough time to cancel it. So they fall in the middle of Miami at a high altitude and many of them are killed during the fall. But Dan and his group land in a rooftop pool. They are horrified when they see the city. But Dorian says worse things will await them.
You don't want to see what happens next.
A person from the headquarters communicates with the team members. Dan talks back to her. The commander explains that the white spikes are occupying the city, so the order has been issued to bombard and completely destroy the city. But their research team is surrounded by aliens in a building. She then asks Dan and his unit to save them before the city is bombed. They enter the building, while no one seems to be alive. The commander orders them to go to the biomedical freezers. Dan and his unit take genetic samples and hard drives. Nora notices that the white spikes are returning to the building. At the same time, the warplanes are preparing to bombard the city. They have 6 minutes to leave before the city is bombed, but when leaving, white spikes appear. The unit shoots at them and at the same time, they try to escape. White spikes kill several of them. As the team leaves the building, Dan alone picks up an axe and fights one of the white spikes. Dorian comes to his aid and kills White Spike. Dorian explains that you can only kill them by shooting them in the neck or stomach. Military vehicles come to their aid. But before the military vehicles can reach them, the white spikes overturn the vehicles. The white spikes have surrounded them and the warplanes are ready to bomb. They try to escape to a safe place.
Get the hell out of there right now!
As hundreds of white spikes chase them, the bombs are dropped and only a few members of the unit manage to escape. The next day, they wake up in the Dominican Republic. Dorian explains that he has no hope for their efforts. When Dan asks why he is fighting, he explains that he has cancer and will die in 6 months. So he wants to die as he likes. At this moment, one of the lieutenants explains that Dan will be transferred to another team. Dan sees the commander. The commander thanks him for retrieving the ampoules. At this moment, a soldier calls Colonel Forrester. Dan thinks he's been called and says he's not the colonel, but he realizes that Colonel Forrester is the commander. Then Dan realizes that she is Muri, his daughter. Dan says he expected Muri to go into science. Muri replies that she did it and is the leader of the research team and has a PhD in biotechnology. She then explains that there are only a few weeks until the end of humanity, so it's not sentimentality that brought Dan here. Rather, she has a reason that she will tell him at the right time. Muri explains that she created a poison that kills male white spikes easily, but has no effect on females. Female white spikes, which are more dangerous, reproduce underground and are rare, so they are protected by males for the survival of their offspring. So they are sent with a professional unit to find a way to kill the females. On the way, Muri explains how the white spikes landed in northern Russia in 2048, far from radar and satellite imagery, and gradually took over the Earth.
We are food, and they are hungry.
Dan then asks about how he is killed 7 years later. But Muri refuses to answer. They have found a female white spike, so they try to anesthetize her with medicine so that they can put her in the cage and perform the necessary tests on her. But White Spike is very dangerous and untamable. Muri enters the hole and does not allow Dan to accompany her. They try to get White Spike into the cage. At this moment, Dan notices that the male White Spikes are rushing there, so he enters the tunnel to help Muri. Finally, they succeed. When they want to take the female White Spike with them, they are attacked by thousands of male White Spike. Dan and Muri get into a military vehicle. While Dan is driving, Muri fires at them. They manage to escape and go to the beach for reinforcements to come to get them out. Meanwhile, Dan asks again about what happened before his death. Muri explains that Dan left them. After a few years, he divorces Emmy and leaves. But one day they are informed from the hospital that Dan had an accident and was killed there. Dan can't believe he did these things. At this moment, a helicopter arrives and takes them away. They enter a research center in the middle of the ocean. The next day, Dan and Muri begin experiments on White Spike to find a way to create a lethal toxin against the females. Muri conducts many experiments to make poison. She must find a way to match 100% with the genetics of the female White Spike. But it cannot find more than 68%. So Dan asks her to let him help, because Muri said she brought Dan here to do something. Muri agrees and explains that the conditions for mass production of poison are no longer here. So Dan must take the poison back in time and produce it to help prevent the war from ever starting. Dan agrees but says he will return to this world to save Muri because he cannot leave her to die. At this moment, 100% matching of the poison is found. Suddenly, they realize that the male White Spikes have attacked the base to save the female. Thousands of White Spikes pass through the minefield and destroy the defense equipment there. So Muri asks Dan to carry the only poison they have so they can bring him back to the past. They try to reach the platform so that they can leave there with the help of a helicopter. Male White Spikes release female White Spike. The female White Spike is very angry and is looking for Dan and Muri. Dan and Muri fight them and Muri damages the female White Spike again. Then, as they approach the helicopter, at the last moment the female White Spike wounds Muri. Dan tries to save her and take her to a safe place. White Spikes destroy all bases and helicopters. With Muri dying, Dan is running out of time to automatically go back in time. At this moment, the female White Spike finds them and tries to kill Muri. Dan tries to save Muri from falling, but he does not succeed and returns to the past. Hart finds Dan. Dan explains that they need to mass produce the poison and send it to the future. But Hart explains that the jump machine is offline with the destruction of the base and they can no longer go to the future. Then Dan sees Charlie alive. When Dan returns home, he is very confused after realizing what is about to happen. He explains to Emmy that he saw Muri in the future and explains about poison. Also about where the White Spikes were first seen. But they should be able to find when the White Spikes first landed on Earth. But in 2048, no one could find their ship. So Emmy says that maybe they're checking the wrong year and the White Spikes landed earlier. So they decide to find a way to prevent things from happening. Dan visits Dorian and asks for his help and explains about saving his daughter. Dorian agrees. So Dan asks him for White Spike's claw. Charlie conducts tests on the claw and notices that there are ash deposits from a volcano in China or Korea on it. Dan asks how the Chinese volcanic ash got to the north of Russia. Charlie says,
"You know any volcano experts?"
Dan remembers his student at school. Martin answers that in 946 AD, the volcano Changbai erupted on the border between Korea and China, the power of which was more than 1,000 nuclear bombs, and its ash covered half the world, and the ash can still be found buried in the ice. Then he explains that scientists have been able to find volcanic ash in the mountains of northern Russia at a depth of 400 meters in the ice. At this moment, they realize that the White Spikes did not come from anywhere else, they actually came from underground. By examining the process of polar ice melting, they realize that the ice will melt in 2048. So Dan says,
We have to get to Russia.
but the political authorities oppose this because there is no solid evidence and the relations between the two countries are very bad in the current situation. So they need to go there themselves. So Dan goes back to James. He asks James for a plane so they can go undetected to the top of a mountain in Russia so they can find a spaceship there. So, after the mass production of poison, they all go to the north of Russia with Hart and her people. They search for a place where the temperature is different. When they succeed, they go deep into the ice with an explosion and manage to find the White Spike ship. Dan explains that if they enter the ship, they may not survive. So they can come back with their documents and unite the governments to defeat the common enemy. But James says governments cannot get along with each other. Charlie and others agree with James' opinion. So they all decide to get into the ship and destroy the White Spikes themselves with their poison. James and Charlie stand guard outside the ship while the others enter. In the ship they find aliens that have been killed. It seems that their ship crashed in this place. They then enter a place where the White Spikes are like payloads being prepared to be used as a planet-cleansing weapon. So they start injecting poisons into White Spikes. But after the destruction of the first group, other White Spikes try to get out of their enclosure. They quickly start injecting poisons. But they leave. Dan informs James to be ready. Dorian wants the C4 bomb to detonate it manually if necessary. Charlie and James fight the White Spikes outside the ship. At this moment, the female White Spike leaves the ship. Others fight them inside the ship. Dan leaves the ship but does not find James and Charlie. Hart and her people trap the White Spikes in the ship and Dorian detonates the bomb to destroy the ship. Dan manages to escape and finds Charlie and James. James explains that White Spike, who had a red belly, managed to escape. So James and Dan go to kill the female White Spike. White Spike sees someone from a distance and attacks him. But when she gets there, James is hiding somewhere and shoots her.
Surprise, dumbass.
White Spike rushes towards James, but Dan hits her with a jet ski on the way. Dan and James start shooting at White Spike again. White Spike disappears in a snowstorm. They search back and forth to find it. Suddenly, White Spike attacks them. Dan manages to blind her, and then he puts the poison in her hand. But she removes her hand and tries to kill Dan. At this moment, James injures his hand so that White Spike attacks him. But Dan attacks White Spike again and hits her in the neck and chest and finally puts the poison in her mouth. And throws her down the mountain with one blow. Dan and James return home. Dan decides to change his future and stay with his family forever. And here the story ends.